Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. We have Carlos Alcaraz versus Felix Auger Aliassime for the semi-final of the 2025 ATP Finals. Very much looking forward to getting into this one because I do think this could be a very competitive semi-final. I won't tell you my pick just yet, of course. We will break down the head-to-head. We'll talk about who they've played so far in this tournament, so who they played in their round-robin matches. And then I'll look at it from a tactical standpoint and, of course, factor in the conditions of it being an indoor hard court. And then ultimately, I'll give you guys my prediction. Before we do get into it, though, remember to that like button, do subscribe if you're new, and do leave a rating or review if you're listening on a podcast platform. Shout out to all of you as well for following, supporting. We appreciate each and every one of you. If you are enjoying the content, do show us some love. We appreciate it. Okay. This is an interesting one for a couple of reasons, because the head-to-head is 4-3 in favor of Alcaraz, and he's won the last 4 matches they played. Felix was 3-0, or 3-love, if you want to call it like that, in the head-to-head. One of them was a retirement at the US Open in 2021, so I won't really count that too much. Sorry, Felix. But the 2 indoor hardcore matches that they played in the rivalry so far were Felix wins in 2022. One was in the Davis Cup, if I'm not mistaken, and he won that one 6-7, 6-4, 6-2. A slight caveat, that was very, very soon after Carlos had just won the US Open, and he'd won that US Open playing a lot of tennis, a lot. Winning a lot of 4- and 5-set matches. So do we take it with a pinch of salt? Maybe. But then Felix did beat him then in Basel in the semi-finals that same year, 6-3, 6-2, again indoors. So I think we can say, well, okay, if Carlos had won that match in Basel, then okay, that Davis Cup match, maybe it was a blip. Maybe it was a bit of an anomaly. Maybe it was a bit of a fluke. But the fact that Felix then beat him again in Basel, I think probably points to the fact that it wasn't a fluke. Since then, they played twice on outdoor hard. Carlos won in straight sets, both at Indian Wells in 23 and 24. And then they played on clay twice in 24, and Carlos won both those matches in straight sets. He hasn't lost a set to Felix since he lost to him in Basel in 2022. But they also haven't played on indoor hard court. And the 2 matches they played on outdoor hard were at Indian Wells, which we know is a slow hard court. And then they played on clay at Roland Garros, and then the Olympics, which again was at Roland Garros, which we know is going to be slow. So these conditions are very different. So the question is going to be, Felix historically on indoor hard courts has caused Carlos problems. He's beaten him. Carlos has not beaten him on indoor hard court as of yet in this rivalry, but that was 3 years ago. Carlos is a very different player from then to now. Felix is also a different player, but not as different as Carlos. I think that's fair to say, right? I think we can all agree. So the question is going to be, can Felix, the attributes that he has to disrupt and cause issues for Alcaraz historically, and also now currently, is that enough to disrupt Alcaraz to get the win? Or is it only a bump in the road for Alcaraz to then eventually get his first win against Felix on an indoor hard court and extend the head-to-head to 5-3? Because is his quality now too much no matter what the surface and conditions are? Right? Because that's what's happened in the last 2 years. In the majority of matches that either himself or Yannick have played against the top 10 players. That's just the way it's been. Before we get into the tactics, I just want to touch upon who they've played in the round robin matches so far. So let's look at Carlos Alcaraz and his matches so far. So he beat Dimino in straight sets in his first match. Then he had a very tight match against Taylor Fritz, the American. And this is an interesting one. And we can maybe draw some comparisons between Fritz and Felix, given the fact that both serve pretty big, especially indoors. Specifically, they've both got very potent serves on indoor hard courts. They both can blast through the court with their forehands. They can really penetrate through the court with their forehand wing. On the backhand, though, Fritz has got a much better backhand than Felix. It has to be said, but Felix moves better than Fritz, and he also volleys better than Fritz. So those are a few of the differentiators. But for Alcaraz, he won that one 6-7, 7-5, 6-3. And then against Musetti, he won that one 6-4, 6-1. And Musetti has a bit more variety, we know, but potentially a bit leggy as well from Athens. And look, he did well, I think, considering that I was unsure if he was even going to win a single match, to be honest. And it was a quick turnaround for him, no doubt, since his Athens final berth, where he was heartbroken, of course, by Novak Djokovic in that final. So, let's break it down. Look, Carlos has been looking pretty good. I have to be honest. He hasn't been serving huge. Against Fritz, he served pretty big, but generally speaking, he hasn't been serving huge, but he has been winning a pretty high amount of first serve points. And what's been even more impressive is actually his second serve point win percentage. 67% against Dimona, 55% against Fritz, 56% against Musetti. He is so good at being able to get to neutral on the front foot in those second serve points. It's crazy. And I don't see Felix being more aggressive or more effective, to be honest, on the second serve points than Fritz. The Zverev-Felix Auger Aliassime match that's just happened, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but the level from both was not very good. Zverev doesn't give a lot of pace to work with unless it's his serve, to be honest. And Felix, I think, struggled to really inject a lot of pace himself. A lot of forehand errors. That level is not going to be enough against Carlos. He needs to bring the level that he had in that first set against Sinner. And against Shelton, he was pretty good as well. But again, I don't necessarily think that level was enough, if I'm being completely honest. So he lost to Yannick 7-5, 6-1. And then against Shelton, it was a really good match. Won that one 4-6, 7-6, 7-5. And then beat Zverev 6-4, 7-6. Look, very clutch, especially on serve. 11 aces against Zverev. 73% of first serves in, 74% of first serve points won. 65% of second serve points won. I mean, only faced 4 break points. Wasn't broken the whole match. And then against Shelton, 80% of first serves in, 77% of first serve points won, 78% of second serve points won. Look, I mean, those are pretty damn good stats from Felix. And I think he just finds it a lot easier indoors on his serve. He clearly loves the conditions, the steel conditions, and he's won a fair amount of titles indoors. And his best surface, I think, is indoor hard court. So if he was to beat Carlos in 2025, the best chance that he'd have would be on an indoor hard court that is pretty quick, like the ATP Finals, which is their fast medium court at the moment. A bit slower than last year, according to the court pace index, but still pretty quick. In between the US Open and Australian Open, I think, is the verdict. Look, there's a few things that Felix can do, and he might look to that Novak Djokovic win against Carlos at the Australian Open and notice that the slider out wide, which is actually one of Felix's favorite serves, that slide serve on the first serve specifically, actually, from Felix, and I know he can slice the second serve as well, but I think that slide serve generally is not a bad ploy against Carlos, just to test the water, see how Carlos is holding up against it. Fritz also utilized it against Alcaraz to to, I would say, a fair amount of effectiveness. To be fair, there was one highlight where Alcaraz was very far behind the baseline and managed to somehow get to a slider, a very good slider from Fritz out wide, and then whip a forehand cross-court winner, which was just an incredible return. But look, even someone like Carlos cannot do that on a regular basis. So that serve was working pretty well for Fritz, and I think that's a definite option for Felix, and he should utilize it, especially if Carlos is standing very far back. Now, the difference that Felix has in comparison to Taylor is that Felix is willing to come forward to the net, and he was doing that against Zverev at times. You have to pick your times and make sure that you're not too predictable, because Carlos can pick you off for the net, of course. But on the serve, if he's able to get enough width on that slider, it's not a bad ploy as variety, in my opinion. I also think the body serve, which he utilized at times against Zverev, is also a good ploy, because going T is fine against Carlos, but when he goes T Felix, he does tend to slice a little bit into the backhand, and I feel like it's generally an easier return for the opponent. And Carlos's backhand return, I would argue, is actually more solid than his forehand return. His forehand can be a lot more dangerous on return, but the backhand is pretty solid and reliable, I would say. And then from the ad court, I think Felix, going T with the slider is not a bad choice. And I actually wonder whether he might try and target the forehand and hit that slider quite often. And also if he does it on the second serve as well. So I'm intrigued to see how that plays out. Djokovic had a lot of success at the Australian Open against Carlos with that on first and second serve, specifically going into the forehand. And it's a big reason why he won that. Carlos adjusted when they played again, and I think he adjusted against Fritz as well. And I think he's handling it better now, and it's not necessarily a glaring weakness or something that you can really take advantage of. But I think it's something that Felix should look to try and exploit, at least as a variety. And if it's working, then you can just continue to hammer that until Carlos adjusts, and maybe he doesn't adjust, and then happy days if you're Felix. On return, I think he needs to be quite proactive, especially on the second serve returns. He cannot be passive. He needs to try and get Alcaraz on the back foot straight away, and I think he needs to be brave, Felix. He was making a fair few forehand errors against Zverev today, and that's not a good sign. But if he can bring his A game, he needs to be going big with the forehand. And he's going to have to try and go toe-to-toe with Carlos on the forehand exchange. And if he's going to go line, it has to be with the intention to really attack that backhand wing, because just changing direction for the sake of it or as variety to disrupt rhythm is not enough, because Carlos will then go big cross court most likely, and the Felix backhand is not going to hold up well against the Carlos backhand. Let's just be honest. Carlos will also utilize a slice, and that for me is a really important point, for me anyway, for Carlos to try and utilize is the backhand slice. He's got a good backhand slice, and I think he should utilize it, because Felix does not like having to generate a lot of pace. We know Carlos can hit the ball big, but Felix will like that because he's able to quite easily absorb pace and redirect. And that's, for me, quite a positive for Felix. But if Carlos can do what he's very good at, which is changing the pace, using variety with a drop shot, with a short slice, with the forehand, hitting flatter, hitting with a bit more topspin, that's when it's going to be really difficult for Felix to get into rhythm and try and dictate proceedings with the forehand. I also think Carlos will try and find angles in the backhand to avoid Felix running around the forehand and going into in or into out of the forehand, which is a go-to for him. And he was utilising that quite a lot against Zverev, because Zverev can hit quite a loopy and passive ball at times into the backhand wing. Look, I think in terms of prediction, it's a tough one, because I do think Felix does have some weapons and definitely some attributes to trouble Carlos. And Look, I mean, out of the group, apart from Yannick, obviously, I mean, Zverev did beat Carlos at the ATP Finals in the past. Shelton, you know, could cause Carlos some issues potentially, but I actually think Felix, on paper, is probably the hardest out of those three to face for Carlos on an indoor hard court. Hopefully his calf is okay. It looked like it was fine versus Zverev and Shelton after a scare against Yannick. It's tough to go against Carlos Alcaraz, though, I think. And I think from what we've seen, he's adjusted very well to the indoor hard courts. This has been the best year we've seen from him at the ATP Tour Finals. And he won Rotterdam, of course, earlier this year. I think he is starting now to get to grips more with the surface. I think it being slightly slower is obviously a bit of a help to him. But it's fast enough that you can say that he's adapted well enough to the conditions. And what's been really impressive to me is the forehand. He has not been looking rushed at all. And I think in the past on indoor hard courts, especially at the ATP Tour Final specifically because it's been so quick, he's looked very rushed on the forehand, whipping in a lot because he just looks so late on a lot of the shots. And we know the forehand can fluctuate quite a bit at times in terms of level. He hasn't been whipping it as much. If he has been, it's mainly been due to variety. But he's been able to take the ball earlier and really hit through the ball flatter and penetrate through the court and rush opponents. And that to me has been a real eye-opener and a sign that he is level-wise in a good place. So my prediction is going to be Carlos. I think Felix will take a set. So I'll say Carlos in 3 sets. Let me know in the comment section below what you think and why. Thanks very much, guys. Stay safe and well, and we'll see you in the next video.